The European colonization of North America is a significant event for both the First Nations people and the British and French colonizers. Two major aspects that affected these groups that bring significance to the European colonization of North America would be religion and disease. Religion played a very important part in the European colonization because the European colonizers would not consider North America as claimed land because the First Nations people were not Christian. This largely impacted the First Nations people as a consequence. The First Nations were moved by the colonizers onto less desired land, and their mission was to convert the First Nations people to Christianity. While the First Nations lost their power, the Europeans gained power. It was hard for the Europeans to convert the First Nations people's faith, which did cause conflict between these two groups. Culture was important to the First Nations people, and they wanted to keep it alive. Religious groups such as Recollects, Jesuits, Capuchins, Ursulines, and Hospitallers were motivated to convert the First Nations faith. Those who did convert received guns from the Europeans. So economically, it had a positive effect on the First Nations who changed their faith, but also gave the Europeans power over them. Another benefit to the Europeans was the churches they built in North America had created taxes and jobs which boosted their economy. Religion is remembered as being a large part of the colonization in North America, because if it were not for the different beliefs between these two groups, the Europeans would have considered North America as claimed land. Spread of disease is another effect of the colonization. During the colonization, the Europeans brought over many diseases. This had a huge impact on the First Nations people. They were not immune to these diseases and had no control or power over the epidemic, because they had no way of curing them. A consequence to this was many of the First Nations people died. In fact, about 90% of the First Nations population is believed to have died from illnesses and diseases brought over by the Europeans. Disease also ties back to religion because when the First Nations people were suffering from the illnesses and diseases, elders and children were the first to be affected, which had an effect on their social structure. This was a big problem for the First Nations culture because the elders were relied on for knowledge and stories, and children were counted on as the future to pass on the stories for future generations. Diseases were often spread during time of trade, and the First Nations would avoid contact with affected Europeans to prevent the spread of disease, which had a negative economic and social effect on the Europeans. But also the First Nations would not have as many options for new resources. The effects of diseases brought over by the Europeans during the colonization is remembered as an epidemic that has largely affected the First Nations culture forever. In conclusion, both religion and disease had affected the First Nations and Europeans during the European colonization in North America, making it a significant event for both groups.